Welcome to the afternoon session, all attendee session. I'm sure some people will be joining us as we go along. All I had to do was go downstairs to grab a sandwich, and it was a fairly short break for me, and others it might have been even tougher. What I wanted to do is to share a couple of the ideas that I didn't get to go through, and some of those I think are a good way to introduce what I learned in a really great session. And we'll get Father Sean started in probably about 10 minutes or so, and I think all things will work out well. I attended the lessons learned session, and I have to say it was really very good. It was very energetic, and my thanks to Fathers Wislecki, Patterson, and Sokolov for doing a great job. They have should they need to, they have a future as a talk show hosts or panelists or guests. I think they did a great job. A couple things that I didn't get to cover this morning that I'll just take a minute or two. Under this topic of positives, and some of these came out in the session I was in, and lessons learned, this is really a time where we're being, yes, forced to change, but we have this opportunity for change. You know, people have you have control over what's going to come back. You know, what is really people are going to see as you come back from the pandemic. So we're as a timeless faith being confronted with embracing new approaches and solutions, and that can be good. Someone mentioned also the idea of encouraging excellence, that they were able to see other parishes doing other things, again via streaming, and we'll have a session later on today about sort of the technical aspects of some of that. But I would certainly agree that if you're interested in upping the game as from a music standpoint, you have an unlimited supply of chances to see how other parishes are doing it. Some doing it very well, and that's it's a goal. With our choir, they're looking at other people and saying, gee, why can't we do that? Why haven't we worked a little harder in trying to be just a little bit better? And the same thing works with regard to preaching. And the issue of newly valued skills. As we go through all this, there are new skills that are becoming important within the parish. And again, the lessons learned session hit on a few of these, as certainly the importance of a technology ministry and people to support the priest in doing some of the things associated with technology, and there are a variety of them. And we heard about Zoom teaching and streaming services. External communication is at a premium now. We're learning, I think, better the importance of talking to others. And so people who are good at art and layout, making things look good on a website, for example, or a Facebook, that's an important skill. The issue of delegating, priests talked a lot about how they had never worked so hard and have a lot of new things they're trying to do, and the need for getting some help and the approaches that are there. I wasn't able to attend Father Tom Soroka's session on discernment of gifts. I hope that was successful. Maybe when I'm done, maybe someone that was in there can offer a comment or two. Certainly we'll hear more from Father Fraze this afternoon about online presenting. There were a number of people as I talked to, and even it came up again in the lessons learned session, it might sound odd that this pandemic became the first chance for some parishes to create a parish email list. In many of our parishes, email has been a standard method of communication daily or weekly for 15 or 20 years, but be it good or bad, many parishes were nudged out of a rut and began using that. And then the whole question of resiliency, as opposed to stagnancy and efficiency, this word resiliency is received a lot of notability in the press, but the whole idea of being able to withstand problem issues and how that can strengthen us as a parish is something that was, I think, very important within the I went the wrong way there. Asking people how they feel, and this is probably a good lead into Father Sean, so maybe I won't land here for too long a period. Some said very positive. Again, these are the feedback we got from you on the survey when you registered. Some were very positive. I said we're very positive. Others, well, we're wondering if the parish will survive. It came up in the lessons learned session that we hope we don't go back to things the way they were, but we'll increase our ministry. Of course, everybody wants a semblance of the past. There was nothing totally wrong with that, of course. And people are very unsure. Limited participation, general timidity, significant disruption to an otherwise healthy parish. So those are a couple of comments from me that I didn't really get a chance to share this morning. I'd like to ask, is there someone that would like to weigh in on what they saw in their session? Anyone from either Father Soroka's session or Father Yarmus's session? Just a couple of quick comments. I came up with a page and a half of notes, so I learned a lot, but I'm a bit of a geek, I suppose. Anyone else that can share some learnings or thoughts on those two sessions? Again, they were hopefully all recorded. You can see them later. Father Stephen, anything you learned in that session?
Well, yeah. I hosted Father Andrew's talk regarding community, and first I thought it went really well. I thought Father Andrew did a great job, but what I found really interesting during the conversations and being the nice thing about being the hosting the Zoom room, I got to basically dive bomb into everybody's breakout session and hear some of the great conversations going on among the participants. And the first thing is that because we had people from all over the country really in that session, that there is a variety of approaches, there's a variety of concerns, how to continue our ministry. Towards the end of our talk, we went a little bit longer than the time allotted, but talking about how do we continue to reach out to our wider community? How do you define our wider community at this time as well? And so I thought the conversations are really powerful as far as the diversity of practices, how everybody's trying to make things work during this time, but also, as you said, it's the same concerns, but just magnified in this time of pandemic and stay-at-home orders and things like that. So.
Okay, anyone? Anything else to add from Father Andrew's session or from Father Soroka's session? Don't die here.
I'll weigh into Father Soroka because I also was the host for him. So it was a very good, informative presentation. Two things that I think that are important. I mean, interesting for those who didn't know. He gave us the definition of diakonia from dia and konos, which really means thoroughly raising up the dust to do ministry, right? So doing ministry is really raising up the dust. And the other important takeaway is for us to understand that part of us being priests, but also those of us who are co-ministers with your priest and bishops and leaders in your parish, is that we need to help people to understand that their skills can be gifts in building up the body of Christ. So how do you help one to understand gifts and skills, and how to translate a skill into a gift to do ministry and building the body of Christ? Those were my takeaways, and I will now be quiet.
Thanks, Father Peter. Anyone else have something to contribute?
Joe?
Yes.
Yeah. I would also like to speak about Father Thomas's forum. And I think that looking at it, from a holistic point of view, it gave me this real strong impression that we have to really be more intentional about what we're doing with our ministries in the church. And so that intentionality, especially about, planning, working, that intentionality is a very, very good thing, and maybe missing, in our ministries.
I would thoroughly agree, Father Paul. I mean, that word intentionality, I think, is used way more by people of Protestant traditions, and I think we do well to build it into our vocabulary. Also, with the concept of giftedness is something that we probably don't appreciate as well as perhaps we should. I'm going to share my screen once more very quickly, and then we'll move on to, and I think you're seeing my screen. I mentioned there are 3 zones that it seems as if parishes have gone through, and I'll talk just a bit about this original fear zone and some of the things that were there, and then we'll maybe at the end of the day, perhaps if we have time at the end, we'll move into the learning zone and the growth zone. But I think originally what we were saying, will our people be affected, infected? How will we pay our bills? Will we do the right things? Will people lose their jobs? Oh my gosh, everything is so different. We're pulled so many directions. I'm overwhelmed, and I don't know how to do that. And as you can imagine, when we got into the learning zone, we tried to start learning how to do some of those things. And so we'll get back to some of these other zones, and maybe that'll be the end of the day when we do that. Oops, I'm sorry. I thought I had those covered up. All right. Now I'd like to introduce Father Sean Levine, who is the Pastoral Counseling Chaplain at Fort Belvoir. He is also the priest in charge of the Fairfax, Virginia Mission Station. You probably read this, but we've given Father Sean a sort of exalted position here. So I think it's important that we all know something about his background. He earned his BA in New Testament literature with a minor in pastoral care. After 3 years in civilian pastoral ministry, enlisted in the U.S. Army. After 4 years, the Army left active duty for Asbury Seminary, where he completed an MA in theological studies, MA in biblical studies. In 2004, re-entered active duty as a Protestant chaplain, spent 2 tours in Iraq. Leaving active duty again in 2007, he attended St. Vladimir's Seminary, where he was ordained to the priesthood in 2009, completed MDiv in 2010, returned again to the Army chaplaincy in October 2010, where he continues to serve. He received an MS in marriage and family therapy from Texas A&M. In order to serve in his present capacity as the family life, and as I think I already said, pastoral counseling chaplain at Fort Belvoir, where he lives with his family. He's presently a Doctor of Ministry student at Erskine Theological Seminary. And his title for our session today is The Lived Experience and Existential Phenomenology of Fear-Based Isolation and Anxiety-Driven Change. Father Sean has promised to me that we will, by the end of this, know something about what all those big words mean. And I am happy to introduce a very, very likable and I'm sure excellent speaker, Father Sean. Welcome.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that introduction and those kind words. It's really my honor to be here with all of you today and to have a chance to share some thoughts about what's happening and where we're headed, at least from perhaps a unique perspective of kind of pastoral counseling and talking about what people are experiencing. I'm going to try to see if I can share my screen with you. One moment, so that I can present this this thing. Okay, coming up. All right, we're almost there. So as mentioned, the title today, The Lived Experience, which is really kind of the colloquial way of saying, in a more fancy fashion, existential phenomenology. You know, the kind of work that I do with people focuses on their lived experience, and the technical term for that is the existential phenomenology of life, of experiences, of various aspects of living, and how people experience them, which is a slightly different aim than somewhat of a focus on diagnosis and categorization. So you'll see the differences between those two things as I talk further. The risk here is that I attach very fancy words to something that you might already know. I hope that I'm not just complicating the obvious. I'm hoping that at the end of this, there will be maybe perhaps an enhanced framework for you as you think about what's going on, in particular with the folks that are coming to church or that can't, the people that we're working with either as clergy or as lay leaders. I'm hoping that you will have at least maybe some new ways of new angles on what is a familiar experience that will be helpful. You already heard all about me, so I didn't know that was going to happen, so I'll skip that quickly. So let's define a couple of key terms real quick. Existential has to do with the human experience of consciousness. Zebras and rabbits and ferrets don't have existential experiences because they're not conscious, sentient beings. They are animals, and they run around and they eat and they do what they do, but they do it kind of out of instinct, and they do not have consciousness the way that human beings do. And so the existential view on life is always looking at how human beings experience things, how the conscious human person engages the reality of the world and seen things, and then the reality of those things that are unseen. Those are often existential experiences or existential crises. In this case, if we're in this pandemic and people are struggling, they are having a crisis of life, perhaps, and that's often what we use the term existential to delineate. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy and psychology that really focuses on how conscious human beings experience the world. They experience themselves, other people, God, all of that. And so an existential phenomenology really is digging down into the nuts and bolts and kind of the molecular structure, if you will, of the lived experience. And it's easy to lose grip on this and to become caught up with various and sundry, technical concerns, or we can also group mass numbers of people into categories, and then we begin to lose. So the more that you abstract an experience, the less existentially and phenomenologically you're looking at it. You become analytic, and you can abstract from the individual up to the category, and the higher you abstract, the less in contact you are with the actual kind of on the ground in the human person experience. And I'm encouraging us to want to look, to resist the urge to categorize like that, and to stay with the lived experience of each of our folks as we wonder what people are experiencing and how they're experiencing it. So then I also want to talk about the fact that each individual human person, has a specific experience, and it can't be reduced. It cannot be ultimately reduced by what I might even be able to see about it. What I can observe in another human being by their behavior, what I might see of their attitudes and perspectives, that's not the whole person. That's not the depth of the person. That's not really the rich interiority of that person. All I can see is what comes out into the light of the world in their behavior and in their attitudes. And so I have to be very conscious of the fact that I'm not looking at the depths of a person when I'm experiencing them in the moment. There's much of them that remains outside of my vision. And I always want to be conscious of the fact that each individual person's experience is irreducible. It can't be turned into a category. It's supremely individual, and honoring that can be very difficult. So as we think about, I was asked to reflect on and talk about what are people experiencing in all of this. And as we go through and talk about that, these are the kinds of These are the ways in which I think about human experience. And I just wanted to lay that out for you, and then have that as the baseline for further conversation. Even though each individual person's experience is profoundly and irreducibly unique, there of course are patterns. So categories in and of themselves are not entirely bad things. We just have to recognize that the farther you abstract from the individual, the less likely you are to really get at where a particular person is. But still, there are categories, there are patterns. We can see these in what looks similar. So when I say the word marriage, church, work, human being, etc., we have a shared idea of what those things might mean. And so categories are helpful in that sense. And yet we can also have a false sense of confidence that when I say church, human being, world, we can have a false sense of confidence that we're on the same page about that. So in general, we might agree, but you might have ideas about those things that I don't see unless we come into real close dialogue. And so while patterns are helpful, they can also be deceiving. And I guess that's what I'm warning us about as we think about what people are experiencing across the country, up into Canada, across the world, in our churches and in the experience of church. Again, fear, concern, anxiety, worry, cowardice, these are all words that we can say and have a shared sense of meaning, but we may not always entirely agree about what those words mean. Likewise, confidence, optimism, hope. Sometimes people are profoundly, maybe they seem profoundly naive, and so their hope might even look to some other people like stupidity or brashness, not being cautious enough, whatever. These again are words that have meaning, and we have a shared sense of what they mean, but until we really talk about them, we might not totally agree about what they mean. What is church? For some people, it's just a matter of sacramental upkeep. I've got to keep in line in good standing with the church by going to receive the sacraments, and if I don't do that, I'm not checking the right blocks. Relational connection. Church can be a meaning-making place. It can be the place where profound educational experiences take place. It could be something very, very much more profound, like constituting the body of Christ within a certain community. So when you say the word church, we might think we all know what we're talking about, and yet there's a variety of ways of looking at the church and what kind of experiences happen in church, and we might not always grab what somebody's talking about when they say these words if we don't spend time really engaging with them. So here's another example that Joe sent me. This slide's a little fuzzy. What's going on right now? I have an idea of what's happening, but other people can have a variety of ideas. I received a lambasting email from somebody who sincerely desired to be a part of our mission station here in Fairfax, Virginia, astounded at my cowardice at not opening the mission station sooner and getting back to quote unquote the way things once were. I have to admit, I crafted, at least 4 emails to this person and deleted all of them before finding the right voice to respond to that. But you can see here, this is just a couple of ways of looking at what's happening right now. And you could put, other than pastor or priest, you could put somebody else in that center circle, whoever it is that's receiving information from somebody about how they feel about what's going on. And these are just a couple of ways in which people have expressed their experience of the present situation. I'm sure there are many more. These are perhaps very representative of some of the most prevalent ways of looking at things. But you can see that each one of these kind of represents a unique spot. Many of them perhaps you don't agree with. Some of them seem inappropriate. Others might seem, well, I could see how someone would feel that way. These are just little blips of personal experience about what's going on and how different people can feel differently about what's taking place. What are people experiencing? any number of these and perhaps others. So part of living as a conscious human person is this incessant drive to make meaning of things. Animals don't experience this, like I said a minute ago. They eat, they eliminate waste, they avoid predators, they make more of themselves, and don't really suffer. Animals can feel pain, we know that, but they don't suffer in a conscious way, and so they're not struggling to define what their lives mean. A ferret or a fox or a grizzly bear, they don't struggle with trying to figure out what they mean in the world, and so they're free of that struggle. Human beings, on the other hand, really are always trying to figure out what something means, and what a thing can mean to one person can be very foreign and different to another. Again, this is probably not something that's new to you, but this is the way human life works. We are always trying to figure out what things mean, what the context of the world means, and what we mean, what human beings mean in all of this. So for conscious life, trying to figure out what meaning to attach to what experience, it occupies a lot of our energy and a lot of our time, and people spend a great deal of conscious and sometimes unconscious effort defining meaning, and in particular when there's a crisis. We don't do this quite as much when things are going well. When something goes south, when it upturns, then we might find ourselves more consciously engaged in figuring out what this or that might mean. This takes up a lot of our human life, a lot of our conscious and unconscious energy. So back to the lived experience, an existential crisis then takes place where somebody's lived experience, what they're experiencing in the world, then kind of collides or aligns with their search for meaning. When those two things might land at the same place in a person's experience, then it can become somewhat of a crisis. What's happening? What does this mean? Who am I? What's going on? And how do I figure out how to respond in the midst of this? So as we said, and as we've noted, church, which was at once probably one of several people, many of our folks, their most precious safe haven, has now become registered as unsafe. And there's no real rapid way of just returning, as we noted a minute ago, to the way things were. Here we are, and here's what we have to deal with. But what's happening? What does it mean? Like, how do we, before we figure out how to respond to something, often we have to decide what it means. And that process of defining meaning may still be going on in many people's lives. And ironically, that which they are trying to find meaning in, the church perhaps, is the place where they are no longer able at some level to relate as they once could. Many people just can't come back. They're at risk. We are not allowed to have as many people in our buildings as we once could. And so there are all of these boundaries and restrictions. And that means that people have limited access to perhaps the one place where they would go to figure out what's going on in the world and in their own experience. And so a precious resource has been removed from their hands. So a key element to the phenomenology of conscious life centers then, as we're working on meaning and figuring out our own experience on the affective domain, the realm of feelings and emotions. This is important to me as a counselor because I see this in my practice all of the time. What people are feeling and why they're feeling it is one of the things that takes up an awful lot of our work between myself and my clients and myself and parishioners. And again, each experience is profoundly subjective and deeply individual. So all of these ways of looking at our present crisis and many, many, many more really are not only rational thinking, but actually often live very much in the affective domain, in the realm of feeling and emotion. And so I want to dwell on that for a little bit. Emotion, I always see emotions as a mentally processed feeling, and feelings are, first of all, body states. It's become kind of almost common parlance to understand that which we have now defined as feelings were first and foremost ways of describing states of the body. The body is one of the first things to move in a response to anything. In fact, the body, it has been calculated now by neuroscientists, the body moves reactively long before the cognitive brain can catch up. That's why when you see a garden hose in your backyard that's been there for 10 years, you still sometimes jump because some part of you thinks it's a snake. That information goes through your eyeballs right into your midbrain, and your amygdala gets into a conversation with other parts of your midbrain, and you jump. And then your cognition catches up and goes, wait a minute, that's the garden hose. It's been there for 10 years, and you take a deep breath and you water your lawn. But you still sometimes will jump because there's a part of your brain that will just move your body very quickly. So the body moves, and it has a great deal of initial reactivity. And these kind of physical states can persist or subside. So a sudden moment of fear can go away. Sometimes people live in a state of fear. Their bodies and their minds are always in a place of worry. And so that can persist and be problematic. So the mind begins to process feeling and turn it into an emotion, a mentalized experience of feeling. And it is this emotion that eventually a conscious self will notice and say, wow, I kind of feel upset. But before you ever can think that thought, the body is already going there. The body's already existing in a certain place, and it takes the cognitive brain a moment to catch up. And it's the last in line. The cognitive process completion into a thought is the last thing to happen in a response. So the affective and the cognitive processes of human beings, these things operate simultaneously on separate tracks and can create some really interesting responses, often responses in us and in others that we have a hard time understanding, let alone anticipating. So I've made these points that the affective response in a person is much quicker than the cognitive analysis in a thinking process. So it's not possible ever to act without thinking. It's very possible to act without thinking rationally. And so thus we are often looking at somebody and their behavior or their thinking and saying to ourselves, that just doesn't seem rational. It's hard to understand. And that means that something's being done out of probably an affective experience. And emotion has its own very, very deep logic. So there are philosophers and scientists that suggest that human beings are preeminently rational beings, and that they always operate on a reasonable platform. And I'm arguing with that and saying that there is an affective domain to human response that is very powerful and can overwhelm and undermine logic and reason. That's why we often look at people and wonder how they could be acting the way they're acting. It makes no sense to us because we're not feeling what they're feeling at the moment. So this can then shape how we approach other people, how we approach the other or the different than us. These are times of high emotion, I think. And if we get frustrated with people, if we get frustrated, recognize first that we're human beings and we're subject to getting frustrated, but also that represents something of a loss of perspective for a moment. We can become reactive, and everybody does this. It's a part of the human experience. The hard thing, I think, to keep in mind is that everybody is doing the best that he or she can from the level of consciousness that he or she's been gifted to rise. And so people are at a particular perspective. They stand on a particular vantage, and they're doing the best they can from that vantage point. That may not be the same vantage point upon which we stand. That's where they're at. And they're probably doing the best they can in the situation that they find themselves to be in. And it's hard to keep that in perspective. I think it's a valuable perspective, however, to maintain, especially now with all of these different ways of viewing what's going on and all the different human responses that you could possibly experience. Again, each person's experience is subjective and individual. It's unrepeatable. It can't be reduced. It's just what it is for that person. And when we begin to categorize people, we can get ourselves into a little bit of trouble. Categorizing simplifies, but it does it by reducing. And it reduces to the objective, making things rather than subjective and personal, an objectification of the other. When you think in your mind, well, he or she is just one of those kinds of people. When we categorize that way, we begin to lose grip of the profound individuality of that particular person. And while it makes assessment simple and quick, it also can threaten to sacrifice the essential humanity of the other person. And this is what I'm hoping and recommending that we in our fatigue and in this very crazy environment not do. That we resist the urge to respond to others in this way, but rather to help them to maintain their personhood, which is tough when you're tired. It's tough when you've called 15 people on a particular day, and the last person you call on the phone has got a piece of their mind to give you about all of this. It's difficult not to turn that other person then into the category of, I don't like you right now, and then reduce their whole personhood to just that moment of experience. I'm asking us to think about not doing that. So the antidote for me to all of that objectifying and all of that potential in our mental and emotional and spiritual fatigue to reduce the other to a category and to set that aside is to think about relating to other people at this time, during this crisis, in this emotionally difficult environment, in this way, to think about interactions between us, between myself and the other, according to this beautiful prayer crafted by Father Deacon Stephen Muse. Lord, love the other through me. Let me love the other through you and be loved by you through the other. This I have on the wall of my counseling room, and this is the model. This is, well, it's not really even a model. It's the image of counseling that I use, but this is really just an image of human interaction that refuses, in the face of each person's existential phenomenology, that person's unique subjectivity, refuses to objectify that person into quote unquote it, but stays with the personal. And we can really only do that in the context of a very deep and a very profound love. And that's a love that comes to us in its fullness in the person of Jesus Christ. And that is then what we're seeking to emulate. So this is called the Dialogos prayer. And again, the idea is to remain in dialogue with other people, not in monologue. It becomes a monologue when I objectify the other person and I only hear from them what I want to hear, and rather than really remaining personally engaged and taking in that person's unique experience, no matter how difficult it might be for me to hear. So we're trying to avoid the monologue of objectification, and we're trying to stay in the dialogue, the loving dialogue that really connects us with other people. This is what I use for my counseling and my interaction with my parishioners. And it can really help all of us to stay with the human being, no matter how frustrating that person might tend to be. Again, so this honors the personhood and the subjectivity. It's a function of love. And it might be important to remember that crises like the one that we're in, it brings out the best in some of us, and it brings out the worst in others. Sometimes it's just a matter of what day. Some days this brings out the best in me, and other days it just brings out the worst. And all of us have both. Thus, this very wonderful quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which is kind of one of my favorites. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. Get rid of those kind of people. But he says the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who's willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, of any person, this line keeps changing. Sometimes it is squeezed the one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he's close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change, and to that name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. So just kind of a reminder that in all of us there are passions, there are flames that can be ignited that will take us in unhelpful directions, as well as always the potential of coming closer and closer and closer to the likeness of Christ. That's true for some of the most frustrating parishioners, even in some of their vehement and rather unkind responses, as it is in our own lives. And perhaps keeping an eye on that will help us as we respond to them and to the people that are not being quite so irritating to us. All right. So, just to conclude, to wrap this portion up, what I've kind of said, and I hope that it's helpful, is that the lived experience is pluriform. It's in many different facets and forms, and it's unique to each person. And that in times like this, especially where things are very different and we're unbalanced and thrown off of our game and off of our rhythm, reactivity can govern an awful lot of our responses. And when one person reacts to another person's reaction, a whole cycle of reactivity can devolve, and it can destroy communion. It can turn relationship into adversarial conflict. And this will never be able to be a place where we can manifest the love of Christ for the other. So watch out, please, for reductive categorization that might deny the other person's subjectivity and personhood. Especially those, this is especially easy for those with whom we disagree and who disagree with us. It's very easy to just lump them into, well, that's just the kind of person he is or she is, and protect ourselves from them by reducing them to that. And I'm asking us to be cautious about that and to help people maintain their uniqueness, even when we don't agree with them and they're difficult to deal with. We can make room in our hearts to love those who choose not to act in love towards us. It's hard. We can do it. And that's what I'm advocating. Our temptation in complicated situations like this one is to simplify things by reduction. And I'm asking us to have a neptic, a watchfulness, a neptic response to that potential, so that we can guard our own hearts and stop reactivity from becoming a non-loving negative feedback loop with people we might have trouble dealing with in this very trying time. Because a lot, as you know this, you've experienced it, priests and lay people alike, bishops, that there are a lot of different responses and not all of them are pleasant. And it's very easy when fatigued to really become negative about people who don't seem to have a common sense or whatever. And so the challenges are very much up for us right now, as the people that we know and love in our parishes are reacting and responding in such pluriform and not always pleasant ways. And I wanted to open up a time of thinking and reflecting on why that is, the affective and emotional domain of the human person that is very fickle and can be easily triggered, and then how we can respond to that with love and with compassion, and rather than objectifying people and turning them into enemies and then simply dispensing with them on that platform. This is easy to do, and I'm hoping to encourage us to remain aware of the many different ways people can respond and how we might then love people who respond even in ways that we find rather discomforting and difficult. So I think that that concludes my presentation. I think we have about 15 minutes, and I'm happy to turn this back over to Joe for some instructions.
Well, that's thank you very much, Father Sean. We will open it for questions. I'll start with one just to kind of get us in the mood here, but the whole question of change. You know, there's many jokes about change, and particularly change in churches. it seems to me that change is even harder when it's sort of anxiety driven, as your title mentioned, and that when we don't get to participate in the choices and the decisions with that. But I wonder if that topic of the way we endure change, if you have some other comments or some guidance with regard to that.
Yeah, certainly. So. I mean, that's a question that strikes right at the heart of my presentation. That when people respond, when you walk into church and half the pews are empty and they've been blocked off, and everybody's wearing masks, it looks different. And it doesn't look right. What registers for a lot of people is no, this is all wrong, and that usually hits first at the level of affect, of emotion. It doesn't feel right, Now we can go through the rational exercise of discussing why we're doing this and what sense it makes, and of course it makes sense. We're responding in ways that are prescribed for us in order to accomplish a particular goal. But that doesn't keep this from hitting a lot of people right in the heart. Like, this just doesn't feel right. It's different, and it doesn't feel good. It's hard to go to church. It's hard to go to church and not feel good about it. It's hard to go to church and have to wrestle with, this just doesn't feel right. It feels different and awkward and strange and all that. So those kinds of experiences, I think, really accentuate exactly what I'm talking about. And so I think there might be a lot of room for compassion there, that when people are when they're off put, it's not something that they're often not choosing that. People aren't necessarily choosing to be upset. They walk in the door with an expectation. The expectation looks a little bit different than what they were hoping, and it hurts. They register disappointment and pain, and then they walk away from church kind of thinking, that just isn't the way that I want this to be. And it's painful for a lot of folks, and I think that's what you're asking about, like, how can we respond to people who come to church and then they just don't have the experience that they were hoping for. It just doesn't feel right. And that's the place where memory and hope and anticipation and dashed expectations all kind of collide in the affective person. And no matter how hard you try, you just can't quite get excited about it. You just can't quite experience the enthusiasm that would have been there when things were the way they were, quote unquote, supposed to be. So it's a very deeply, I think it's a very problematic thing. We're trying to do the best that we can, and I think it's important as leaders to recognize the best that we can may be very disappointing for some people, and that doesn't mean that they're not good people. They're just really kind of not pleased with what's going on. And of course, we become the place where they project their displeasure. And if we respond to that negatively, we lose a chance to really open up to the hurt of many people who really wish that this was not happening and don't quite know how to handle the emotions that go with that.
Thank you, Father. I think there is greater resistance to changes that we don't control. I mean, a parish can come together and talk something out and can make some conclusions that result in maybe some changes, but they have been able to control that. And so much of what we're doing today, it's out of our control. I'm seeing a lot of great comments or good comments within the chat segment. I'm missing one here. Susie Ford asked, is there a verbal path? I assume this is meant to be a question, Susie. Is there a verbal path to lead a conversation from monologue to an open, positive dialogue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what I'm always helping to, I always coach the couples that I see. They're always coming to me because they're in crisis. And every marriage session I ever lead, every couple that comes to me always, without fail, says there's something wrong with our communication. And And what ends up happening very quickly is us figuring out that they are engaged in conflicting monologues rather than in connecting dialogues. And really the verbal path to dialogue actually starts without saying a whole lot. It starts with a lot more listening. And so I encourage people to do just a ton more reflective listening, so that they can articulate to the person opposite to them that they're hearing what's actually being said. And so the verbal path, it sounds a whole lot like, okay, I think I hear what you're saying. Let me say it back to you, and then you tell me if I've got it right, so that I can really know that I'm with you. And if you're listening to somebody with the intent to respond in point counterpoint fashion, you're arguing with them, and that never really leads to a helpful dialogue. The dialogue is far more about active listening and reflective listening while you're the listener, and that really tends to help keep the space open of hearing. Often people aren't hearing one another; they're simply listening long enough to figure out how they're going to respond when the person stops talking, and they just stop listening, and that's where the dialogue collapses and becomes a monologue that will not typically lead to any kind of relational resolution. I hope that's helpful.
Yep, I see Father Simeon Johnson mentioned some similar things. Father Simeon, do you have anything to add to what Father Sean just said? A different perspective, and perhaps not. If you do, join in. Also, my system tells me that there were two people with their hands raised wanting to make a comment, but I'm not smart enough to find those hands. So if you raise your hand, this is a good time. Oh, Jennifer, go ahead with, I think you had a question, Jennifer Haynes. Are you there, Jennifer?
Sorry about that. My hand wasn't clicking, my finger button was.
Oh.
What's the best advice you can give dealing with social justice warriors in the parish that maybe call you a racist versus the message of the gospel? Like how do we heal or move forward from this? And I did hear your comment about reflective listening. Is there anything you can add to that? Thank you.
Oh, that's a tough one, because those are hard. Those are really hard conversations. So I'll add to my advocacy for reflective listening, which looks a whole lot like, hey, let me see if I understand what you're saying. I will add that it's very, very appropriate to establish also certain kind of boundaries around conversations. So not all conversations need to be had. Not all of them need to be extended ad infinitum. And so there are conversations where I think it's safe to say the best bet is to kind of close it up. So if somebody is trying to impose a monological diatribe on you, then they have also succumbed to a reactivity that is refusing your personhood and is refusing your subjectivity. And I don't think you have to endure that long term. I want to give somebody a chance. I want to hear somebody out. But if it's going to be a finger in my face of accusation, I don't have time in my life to spare for that kind of experience. And in fact, those can devolve into moments where we are actually not helping this person, because we are allowing them to just fall smack into their passions. And sometimes it's really the most helpful thing to do to say, hey, you need to stop. So I'm not saying that you have to subject yourself without boundaries to the vehemence of other people. And only we can know for ourselves where that line is, where we're kind of done. And it's time to tell somebody, hey, thank you for sharing your opinion. I'm going to have to stop now and move on. So I would hope that within those conversations, there might open up a space for you to respond in grace and love even if you disagree profoundly with the person that's speaking to you. But I would also add that we don't need to be victimized by other people's sometimes hatred or their complete lack of perspective. There are times where you have to, you're not going to be allowed to dialogue, and that might be the chance, that might be the time where the best thing to do is to close the conversation. So there's the two sides of it, trying to remain open and dialogical. If somebody is going to refuse to go there with you, then sometimes the most gracious thing we can do is just simply ask them to stop. I'm going to have to leave this conversation, and maybe we can engage this in a different tone at another time.
Great, thanks, Father. My computer is telling me it's a little after 2:12. We probably have 2.5 minutes left, and we want to make sure we give people, it's only a 15-minute break coming up. If there is one more quick question and a quick answer, we can take that. If not, I'll just sort of put us on a path to the next sessions. Does someone want to chime in quickly with a compact question that we can deal with? In one of our next sessions, Father Stephen Fraze will tell us that normally in class he waits 5 seconds, but on an online session he waits 10 seconds. So I think we're getting close to 10 seconds. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen again. I'm sure you're dying to see that. And we'll talk about what's coming up next, which is, of course, a break. We've now completed Father Sean's session, and we have then 2 more segments in which we have choices of going to one of 3 places. In the next segment, we'll have Father Stephen Fraze talking from his experience as a teacher, classroom teacher, about some practical tips for leading parish classes online. Father Peter Bactus will be joined by Father Paul Janakis, and they will be exploring the idea that, we rarely have times when the world is reaching out and thirsting to hear the gospel such as we have right now. And so the question is, how can we maybe do as good a job as possible? How can we do a better job of talking to America and framing our discussion and as we understand it and know it as Orthodox Christians? And finally, this third session is what has been labeled a sort of techie session by Steve Adams, Phil Tizar, and again, Father Nicholas Waslitsky. If we're going to stream, if we're going to stream, let's, Father Sean just talked about people screaming at you. If we're going to stream, let's do it well. And so they'll be sharing some of the perspectives they have, being pretty good techies. It's like owning a boat. Nobody knows everything about everything. You can always find a bigger boat and want a bigger boat, but these 3 are very knowledgeable. And if you have questions, they will help to answer those. The question was asked earlier, will these groups break down into small subgroups? And the answer is it depends on how many people are there and the way the group leaders choose to do it. So with that, probably, I think I have a text here telling me to remind to those hosting Zoom sessions, please be sure to administer the evaluation poll. Yes, I think we have a little poll for everybody afterwards, and so let's make sure we leave 2 or 3 minutes for people to react to what they heard in the session. So with that, I'm going to pronounce our next break to happen almost exactly on time. I'm astounding myself.
And I'm going to try to put my slide presentation in a folder or somewhere where y'all can get a hold of it, and I'll include my email. If I can clarify anything, please send me a note.
Yes, and that goes for everyone's slide presentation. We may not have them at this moment, but that will be available, again, accessible through the Google Docs. And probably Father Fraze will do that since he's far more competent than I am. Okay, class dismissed. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Shane. Go Army.
Amen. Cool.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Father Sean. Thank you.
Bye, Father Justin. Good to see you.
See you.
Thank you so much.
Good. Loved
My
your
pleasure.
family.
You too.